So I'm going to confess, I didn't read any of Stephen King's books for many, many years because I just did not like the front covers. Stay with me to find out more. Don't judge a book by its cover. We have all heard that saying, but I'm pretty sure we've all done it, yeah? Hey, welcome back to Bookish Brummy. My name's Mel, and primarily I like to review books, but I also like to talk about other things that are book related. And today's video is going to be about book covers. Now, as you've seen from the intro, I've admitted that I did not read Stephen King for years and years and years because I didn't like his book covers. And I know it sounds really mad, but it's that simple. And if we think about it, Stephen King started publishing in the 70s and he has published over 70 books. He's published a huge amount of books, and for the most part, if you don't know anything about Stephen King and you're not really reading his books, or you don't know anybody that reads his books, you just kind of understand that he's a horror author. And that, he had a book called The Shining, and then he had one called Misery, and you've probably seen a couple of his films on TV, but you may not have actually read the books. You may have just read the film, watched the film adaptations. But he is kind of typecast as a horror author. Now, I wasn't born in the early 70s, I was born in the later 80s, so all through my life, Stephen King's books have been present and available to buy on bookshelves, and they have never, ever caught my attention up until the last few years ago when the Ultimate Storyteller collection was released by Hodder and Stoughton. Now, I really wanted to talk about this because this month I'm doing King Family February, so I'm basically reading all the books I can find that Stephen King's family has published, because himself and all the members of his family are writers. But it got me thinking about Stephen King because I've actually only been a Stephen King reader for about a year. I read my first Stephen King in March last year. And, as I said, up until then, he had not even been on my radar. I had heard of him. I knew he was a horror author. I knew that he had been behind the original book that was behind the Shawshank Redemption film and the Green Mile films, which are two of my all-time favourite films, if I'm honest, but it never really sort of swayed me to read the book. And the reason for this is, one, I never really sort of realised that I liked horror, and two, I didn't realise that Stephen King had a lot more depth. I just assumed he was a horror writer, but he's not. He writes crime really well, he writes suspense really well. A lot of his horror is not necessarily gore horror, which is what you think of when people say horror. A lot of it is more like psychological horror, I think, or paranormal horror. And I didn't really understand the distinctions between these categories because it just wasn't really a genre that I'd been reading in until the last couple of years. But also this idea that he had been typecast as a horror author, I just thought, oh, I'm probably not going to enjoy his books. But also the book covers on his books, they just weren't inviting to me. They did not make me want to pick them up off the shelf. And I think that's where a book cover can be really important to a writer. If they're unknown to the reader, they need to have something which is going to pull the reader in to actually want to read the back of the book cover in the first place. And whilst I've heard of Stephen King, I've never read any of his stuff, and I walk past his stuff on the shelves, and none of it ever jumped off the shelf in a way that was like, oh, you look pretty, or oh, that looks like an interesting front cover, or that looks like an interesting spine. I want to find out what this book is about, for starters. And I feel like a lot of the covers are quite gruesome on the old Stephen King books. And now there's, I can't really sort of specify each individual cover, and this is obviously subjective to me because I know a lot of other people actually really enjoy going around collecting all the old Stephen King covers, and I think that's kind of cool. I've watched a couple of people doing those sort of videos, and I hadn't realised that there had been so many iterations of covers for like It and stories like that. But there's actually been a phenomenal amount. But if we kind of look at the old classic ones from like the 80s and 90s, a lot of them are really scary looking, when actually the book in itself is possibly not that scary. So I've seen like one of Misery, for example, which you may have the impression that the main character in it is some kind of axe murderer. Well, yeah, she's got an axe, but she's not an axe murderer in, like Scream axe murderer is what you're sort of getting from the cover. That's not actually really what the inside of the book is about. So I do feel like some of the old classic covers of his don't really represent the inside of the book. And I think The Stand is a really good example of this. So I'm just going to put this classic cover up on the screen now. Now, I know a load of people really like this cover and they really covet this cover, and they try to collect it. And that's absolutely fine. I'm not saying that you're wrong for that. But I think as a person, you know, who might not have known anything about Stephen King at the time, this cover says nothing to me about virus outbreak. And that's what I understand The Stand is actually about now. This to me makes it look like some kind of fantasy novel. So again, I wouldn't have been interested in it because I'm sort of getting into a bit of fantasy now, but I'm not a massive fantasy reader. So again, that sort of cover put me off. I'm also going to put the classic cover to The Shining up on the screen. Again, there's nothing about this cover that attracts me to think I want to read about that. But I also have this thing where I don't really like seeing people so much on the cover. So yeah, and then I think a lot of the iterations of The Shining after that had pictures of Jack Nicholson's face on it, you know, in that really terrifying scene where he's like poking through the door and stuff. And again, like that didn't really attract me on a book cover, but I also don't really like it when they use film stills on book covers. That really puts me off a book altogether, to be honest, when people do that. So what I'm just sort of saying here, I know that book covers are subjective, and there's a lot of people here that are actually going out and collecting all those classic Stephen King covers, and good for you. It's nice to have a collection, and I totally understand that. But from my perspective, you know, there was nobody around me in my family reading the Stephen King book, so I didn't know anything really about the stories. I didn't have anybody sort of say, oh, I've read this book, I'd recommend it to you. You know, so he was just a horror author over there, somebody I'd never had anything to do with, and there was really nothing about his covers that were like pulling me in. I've got to be honest, like from what I heard, you know, I just thought that his stories were probably horror stories written by a man for other men who like gore. That was generally the impression that I got from his front covers. And now I know that that impression is completely wrong, because I've now actually read over 30 Stephen King books out of his collection, and that's not the case at all. Actually, they're quite accessible. I think that, you know, they're good stories for everybody, not just men. I think women can enjoy them too. But the only reason that I really got into reading that is that the Ultimate Storyteller collection was released by Hodder and Stoughton. Now, the Ultimate Storyteller collection is the one that you see behind me here with all the rainbow spines. And they completely recovered most of Stephen King's collection. And I think it's really, really beautiful. And it was because Amazon recommended me a book, I think, and I can't remember which one it was. I thought, oh, that looks like a really nice front cover. Is that a new Stephen King book? Because, you know, I wouldn't know all of the books that he had done at that point, like a year ago. And so I had a look into it, and then I noticed that there were a couple more that were sort of covered the same. And then I actually felt like I wanted to read the synopsis on that book. So I think actually one of the first ones that I read was Elevation, which is a novella, but I did like the cover. So I felt like compelled to read the back of it. And I think also Different Seasons was one of the first ones I bought, and also Firestarter. Now I know that I really don't like the old cover of Firestarter. Like the cover does absolutely nothing for me, but the new cover in the Ultimate Storyteller collection was much more appealing. So again, it made me want to scroll down, read what that book is actually about, and I thought, oh, actually Firestarter sounds like really, really interesting. So I purchased a couple off Amazon. So I think, you know, although they say don't judge book by its cover, and clearly my original interpretation of Stephen King's collection of books was wrong, but I had formulated that opinion based on how he had been stereotyped, like how as a horror author, and what covers I'd seen available to buy in the shops, and none of them had interested me. So I think covers are actually really, really important to pulling a reader in or attracting them into your book to read it in the first place, because front covers as well are kind of like a different language, aren't they? They tell us sort of what we think we're going to find in between the pages. So I think a really good example of this would be, for example, romance novels. They sort of have a kind of way about them, don't they? They sort of seem like AI generated images at the moment, and the people on the covers don't really have too many expressions. It's normally just like the outline of the character, and the character is normally, you know, got their arm around the other main character, and they're normally dressed in a costume or in a location, but there's not much detailing on the pictures, you know. And I think that's like the sort of more modern romance novel, but when you see that, that's kind of like, you know, in a shop you go, oh, that's romance. So if you're into the romance genre, you're probably attracted to the books that look like that on the shelf. But me, I'm not so much into it, so I kind of see that front cover and I just know that's not my section and I move on. So yeah, I think covers can indicate to a reader what kind of genre that, you know, it's going to be, and then whether or not they feel I should even bother looking at it in the first place. So the other thing that I was going to say about this, when we go back to 80s covers and the fact of them being redone, the fact that the Stephen King covers were redone has obviously been a massive impact to me, because obviously I've been reading his books and I've really enjoyed his books now, and you know, I also really enjoy collecting them. I'm a bit of a magpie. I do like these coloured spines, and I feel at the moment I've got them arranged in publication order. However, if you're looking too closely at this shelf, the top shelf is publication order of what I've read, the bottom shelf is publication order of what I haven't read, so that's why it might not line up if you're seeing it in my background, but that's the general order I've got on there. But that's opened up a whole new author to me. But I also think Virginia Andrews is the same. So I have these classic Virginia Andrews books in my collection, and these actually used to belong to my grandmother, so they're special to me. But quite frankly, I don't feel like I would want to read these books based on how they look. I mean, they're just not very appealing, these designs at all. But in the new collection today, they've recovered them. So they all sort of follow the same kind of theme, which means that, you know, I found this far more attractive, and I saw this one for Flowers in the Attic, which is the first one in this series, and I don't actually own it for this series. This is book 3 and 4 that I have. But this actually made me want to pull it off the shelf, and I thought, oh, I remember people talking about that book from school. That looks interesting, that's a nice cover. I wonder what it's about. And I pulled it off the shelf. If I wasn't attracted by the cover, I probably never would have pulled it off the shelf. I'd probably never have had a conversation with my gran about it, and I probably now wouldn't own these, which I actually treasure, as I said, because they used to be hers. So again, recovering older book covers I think is really important to get in a new readership, because I think, you know, if I could remember the 80s, maybe I'd have been attracted to those covers, you know, but time has moved on and imagery has moved on, so yeah, they were not so exciting to me now. I think it's also important to mention, as we're going through this as well, again, I have sort of mentioned that it's subjective, but this is subjective. So all of the opinions expressed in this video are just my opinions about how I feel about these book covers and how they've affected my journey with certain authors and whether or not I have read them. I appreciate that other people may like those covers, and I'm not trying to diss the people who designed these covers or whatever, because there's always an audience for everything. It's just I'm saying that I didn't like them. Okay, so another really good example of a book that I didn't read for ages or buy for ages was A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. Okay, I'm just going to put up the original cover on here. Now, I really dislike this cover. You know, I don't really like people on my front covers anyway, and this person is pulling a really weird face. And it kind of reminds me of in the 90s when you used to watch those yogurt adverts and people would like take a bite of yogurt off the spoon and look like they were having some kind of whale of a time, which was way better than just having a spoonful of yogurt. This is kind of what this cover reminds me of. It's like really over dramatic and excessive, and I just don't want to pick up a book that's big or have it on my night table next to me with a cover like that. I really didn't like it. But then I noticed that there was a new cover that came out, which was this one, which doesn't offend me, to be honest. It doesn't make me think, oh God, I don't want to keep looking at that. So that's when I was actually able to buy this book and read it. And I have actually read this book and I reviewed it a couple of weeks ago, you know, and it is a really, really powerful piece of literature. And I think it's a bit of a shame that for a couple of years, I basically just boycotted this book because I was like, no, I can't read it with that cover. There has to be a better cover. Now, I'm aware that you can use things to cover the covers of your books, but let's be real, my TBR and most people's TBRs are so big that if the book is just not appealing to me as it's coming off the shelf, I can't be bothered with it because there's a lot more that I can be bothered with. So, you know, I'm not really going to go out of my way to cover a book unless somebody tells me, like, this is the most amazing book that you'll ever read in your life. Like, you have to read it, and I trust their judgment and think, oh, okay. Then maybe if I didn't like the cover, I'd, you know, change it. And then another good example as well is the Vampire Chronicles. So the Vampire Chronicles, written by Anne Rice, again, I think the first one was published in 1983, which would have been Interview with the Vampire. So they've had quite a few iterations of covers as well. But I want to talk about the current iteration of covers actually, which is kind of like the style. Now, these are really uninspiring. Like, I really feel like they could come up with nicer covers than these are. I just don't think they're very nice, to be honest. And the Queen of the Damned is of a similar vein, just in a different colour. But I had read the film I had watched the film for Interview with the Vampire quite a few times and thought it was a really, really good film, and that's what drove me to want to read the book. So if I had never have watched the film, would I have bothered picking these off the shelf? I'm not entirely sure I would have done, because they just wouldn't have catch my attention, because they were a bit unimaginative, if I'm honest. And then also there's the fact that sometimes between America and the UK that there are different kinds of book covers as well. And so another really good example of something that I may not have read is House of Monstrous Women by Daphne Fama. Now, I think this is an absolutely stunning front cover. I mean, it's really, really beautiful. You know, it has a nice spine, really nice design on the front cover. I think whoever designed this did an absolutely cracking job, and this draws my attention to it. This makes me want to know what's inside this book. But this is the British front cover, and when I actually started looking for reviews of this online, I came across a completely different front cover, which seems to be purple with a lady on it. So I'm just going to put that on the screen now. And I believe this must be the American version of the front cover, because this only came out at the end of October 2025, so it can't have had several rounds of front covers already. So this is what I mean. I'm sort of thinking this must be the British version and the purple one is the American version. But I find the purple one, the American one, I really don't like it. There's nothing about that cover that makes me think haunted house or horror story, or, you know, there's nothing about it that attracts me to it, that makes me look at it against any other book on the shelf and think that that one deserves my attention. Whereas this one is like, bam, you know, and even in Waterstones, when you're seeing this one on the shelf, it really stands out from all of the others. And this was an absolutely cracking story as well. So I'm going to review this one on Monday, but it was a really, really, really good read. So in this instance, we had a very nice front cover and we had a good book. So, you know, there's just a few instances there of books where, you know, I haven't necessarily been attracted to the covers in the first place, but obviously when I've got into the insides of those books, they've actually been amazing stories. I think another book I could probably talk about is Piranesi by Suzanne Clarke. So I don't own this book and I've never read this book, but I was interested in this book because it was the Women's Prize for Fiction winner, I want to say in 2020, but I may have got the year wrong. And I, you know, enjoy the Women's Prize for Fiction books on the whole. But I am put off reading this book because the front cover indicates to me that it might be a Greek myth retelling story, and I actually don't really like those. However, I can't really tell from the back of the book what it's about, and then when I've heard people review the book, people are like, I don't really know what I just read, but it's really good. So with this book, I'm a little bit confused. The front cover is giving me a vibe of some Greek retelling. I don't like them, so that puts me off. But then the fact that it's Women's Prize for Fiction winner makes me think maybe I should try it. So again, with that book, the cover makes me uncertain what it is that I'm getting. I'm also not sure that a Greek retelling would win the Women's Prize for Fiction. I mean, normally, you know, the competition is really, really high in that area. So if you're retelling somebody else's story, I mean, it would have to be absolutely outstanding, I would imagine, to then beat everything else on the list, but I don't know. But again, that's an example as a reader where I'm a little bit confused by the cover actually and what's in it, and I couldn't really tell you what's in it at the moment. I'd say, as well as the front cover actually being important to a book, that the spine of a book is really important. So if you are, you know, an avid reader of a certain author, to be honest, you're going to buy their books, probably whatever the cover or whatever the spine is, and you will walk into your local bookstore and you will check for that author every time you go in. There are certain authors at the moment that I'm collecting their back catalogue, so to be honest, it wouldn't really matter what was printed on the cover. I know I really like that author and I want to read all their books, so Even if they didn't have a front cover on them, I would probably still buy them. Like, for example, Barbara Kingsolver. I'm trying to buy all of her books because I really think she's an absolutely amazing author, and I can't imagine she's written anything that I didn't like. So on that respect, I'm not really bothered when I go into the store to be attracted by the spines of her books because I'm looking for her books. But how many times do you go into a bookstore just to have a look around? Because I do that. I, really enjoy going into Waterstones, going into Foyles, or going into these independent bookshops and just standing there, walking around the shelves, looking at all the books. I like it when bookshops organise their books into genre sections, so I'll normally go to, contemporary, genre, and when I was collecting all the Stephen Kings, I would go to the horror genre quite a bit, also like historical fiction, so I'll go to the sort of genre category of shelves that, I'm most into, and then I will sit and scan all of the, the books. But in a bookshop, for the most part, you're only going to see the spine of the book sticking out from the shelf, unless, of course, the book is a new release, and then you'll be seeing the front cover because they've probably put it in the window or they've probably put it on a stand somewhere. So a good example of a spine catching my attention was I was in the bookstore at the beginning of January, or it might have been the end of December. No, it would have been the end of December, I think, or the end of November, around the end of last year, and I saw T.C. Boyle, The Terranauts, on the shelf. Now, I didn't know T.C. Boyle as an author, never read any of his books, but the way that the spine was between all the other books on the shelf, it just stood out to me, and I just saw it and thought, oh, that looks interesting. And so I pulled it off the shelf and read the blurb on the back, and I thought, from the blurb on the back, that sounds exactly like the kind of thing that I would like to read. But I didn't go into the bookshop looking for it, but it attracted me off the shelf. Another example when this has happened is with The Air Affair by Jasper Fforde. So there's actually a whole series of these. If we look at the spine's really, really nice. Like, there's a lot of attention to detail on that spine, and the colouring's really nice. But the whole series of books is sort of in the same covering and the same spine. I'd never heard of this before. I bought this probably in June last year, and it was because I'd walked into a Waterstones and just saw it on the shelf, like the spine, pulled it out and decided that I wanted to read what was on the back of it because it really appealed to me. So I actually think the spine of a book is probably as important, if not more important in the end than the front of the book, because, after a book has been released and sort of been, displayed face up for everybody to see for a couple of months, and for the rest of its life, it's probably going to be stored like that, isn't it? So, and also, I think spines are important for people because when they actually put them on their bookshelves at home, most of the time, you're just going to see the spines here. So this is another reason why I really like the Storyteller collection, like the Ultimate Storyteller collection that Hodder and Stoughton have done, because I can play with these spines. You can put them in colour order, you can put them in publication order, you could have like a red section if you wanted to, and for me, part of collecting books is actually being able to enjoy looking at them as well. Now, not everybody's like that. Most people just, might read a book and then they don't really care what it looks like afterwards, or they might, throw it out of their collection or whatever. But for books that I really enjoy and that I keep in my collection, I like the way that they look. I like them to be presented nicely on my shelf, and I really like them to be uniform. So if I have started a collection, I like the collection to look all the same. So Kate Morton has all her books have been recovered in the last couple of years as well, so just put them up on the screen now. But they just look really nice and uniform on the shelf now, because you haven't got a variety of all different styles. You've just got like one style, and I really like that. Robin Hobb's books tend to have a specific style to them, so when they're all lined up on the shelf, they look really nice. And again, like the Charlene Harris ones I'm reading, all have the same kind of covers, so that's really nice. So I really, really appreciate that as a reader. One thing I'm really struggling with at the moment is the Jane Casey Maeve Kerrigan series. So I really love the Jane Casey Maeve Kerrigan series. I think it's my favourite detective series that I've read so far, and Jane Casey is an absolute brilliant author, and I obviously own that whole collection, and I've really, really enjoyed reading it. But the one thing I'm really struggling with is that I don't think one particular publisher has the rights to all of her work. So at the moment, there are 3 different designs going around for her books. So we have the beginning of the series, which I think is 1 to 6, it seems to be owned by Penguin Books, and they are this sort of spine and cover, and they're all in the same kind of style, and I actually really like this. It's a nice style. Then we have book number 10 is owned by HarperCollins, so they've got a slightly different style, which is, it's not too dissimilar to this, to be honest. However, you've got books 7, 8, 9, 11 and 12 seem to be owned by Hemlock Press, and they are all in this style. So when you actually put them all on the shelf together, like, they're not really sort of matching up. Now, I'm not going to stop reading these or stop collecting these because of that, because as I said, Jane Casey is one of my favourite authors and I absolutely love this series. But it is a real bugbear of mine on my shelf, that essentially, you know, got 3 different publishers owning the book and we don't have one actual style for the entire series. Like, that just is a small bugbear of mine. So yeah, I think possibly if I was looking to collect an author's books, I may wait to see if they had a unified range before going out and buying all the separate ones. Like, I'm not really sure. I don't know if I've been in that situation before. But anyway, I think what I'm trying to say with this video is that I think that whilst we say don't judge a book by its cover, and I understand, like, you know, yeah, probably you shouldn't, but we all do, and I do, and as part of me being a collector, I actually think, you know, being able to like the front cover and being able to like the spine of the book is quite important, because for me it's not just about buying the book and reading the book, it's about, you know, how the book looks afterwards and having it there on display for me to look at. I enjoy all of that, and that's what it sort of means to me to be a collector, I guess, as well as a reader. But I thought that this video was quite a good one to publish, as I do have a bit of a spotlight on Stephen King this month, and it's actually funny that his books were some of the main books that I actually avoided for many years. For like the first 37 years of my life, I have completely avoided Stephen King books because I didn't like the cover, so I thought I wouldn't like what was in them. Anyway, let me know in the comments down below how you feel about book covers. Have you had any major surprises? Have you got a book where you really hate the front cover but you love what's inside? Or have you had a writer who you've been avoiding reading their stuff because you were put off by their covers and didn't realise, you know, until much later on, oh yeah, actually I do like that, like I have with Stephen King? Or maybe you felt the same about Stephen King's original covers, I don't know. But anyway, if you have anything to add to this topic of conversation, please say it in the comments down below. And if you've enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and if you'd like to see more of my content, please press the subscribe button. I'll be back on Monday with my weekly review. Bye!